Okay, and let me do this. And Janet, can you see my screen now? Can you
Yes,
see my PowerPoint?
yes.
Well,
Yep.
we can get started. All right. Well, thanks again to Janice for inviting me, and she stole my opening by talking about Uxoricide. So, uh, but that's great. I enjoyed visiting with all of you and sitting through your meeting. It's an honor to speak to a group that includes so many writers and published authors. Although I was in the newspaper business full time for 43 years and still do some newspaper writing, many of you have much more experience than I do authoring a book. This was my first. Thank you in advance for letting me tell the story of how I uncovered the truth about my great-grandmother's violent murder by her jealous second husband, and then wrote a book about it. Because so many authors are in the group, I'll also talk about the challenges of promoting my book during a pandemic. And hopefully we'll have time for questions. So, who remembers when potato mashers looked like this? Almost like the end of a baseball bat, but with a handle. Swung like a baseball bat, a potato masher could be a deadly weapon. And that was the case in my great-grandmother's.
Wait a minute.
Yes. The murder of my great-grandmother was and I have forgotten to record this. Am I supposed to be recording this? Yes, and I don't know if I have a control for that. No, I do not see a control for that right at the moment. So I apologize for that.
What am I doing now?
The murder of my great-grandmother, Cecilia, was a family secret, rarely mentioned when we got together and only cryptically when it was. I spent a lot of time with my maternal grandfather growing up, but he never mentioned that his mother had been murdered when he was 14. Finally, in 1996, as I started researching our family tree, I got my mother to talk a little bit about the murder. She had the wrong year and the wrong location. She thought it occurred in LaPorte, Indiana, her father's hometown, but she volunteered enough information to get me started on what became a 24-year quest to learn the truth. The quest began with a letter I wrote to Fern Eddy Schultz, the historian for LaPorte County, Indiana. Her detailed research uncovered when and where the murder occurred, September 25th, 1906 in Mishawaka, Indiana. She also located a copy of my great-grandparents' divorce decree. It's important to remember that Cecilia's first husband, my great-grandfather, beat her, but it was the second husband who killed her. Fern also sent me the first of what would grow to dozens, perhaps hundreds of newspaper clippings about the murder. My journalism history professor, Dr. William Howard Taft at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, Dr. Taft was right when he taught us that newspapers are an important tool for historians, and heaven help us if newspapers disappear, heaven help historians and authors. I wasn't the only family member who contacted Fern in 1996. Fern put me in touch with Paula Steiner, a distant cousin in California, whom I didn't know existed. Paula shared what she knew about the tragedy and, most importantly, the only known photo of my great-grandmother, which you can see on the left here, and Cecilia's parents, James and Christina Henderson. The Hendersons were Scottish immigrants who settled in Kingsbury, Indiana, near LaPorte in the 1880s. And that's where my research stalled until 2016 when I broke my ankle 6 months into retirement and was largely homebound for 2 months. Fortunately, during that 20-year lapse, websites like genealogybank.com, ancestry.com, and newspapers.com were introduced. While I was laid up, I plunged back into investigating Cecilia's murder and discovered a treasure trove of material about it on the internet. When I was interviewed by a columnist for the South Bend Tribune, and she heard my story, and she said, well, I guess the secret to writing a book is to break an ankle. And I said, I guess so. So by August 2016, I was recovered enough for Helen and me to make our first research trip to Northern Indiana. And that trip included a day reviewing microfilm of the Mishawaka and South Bend newspapers. They are not online, or they weren't online when I started this. So we reviewed the newspaper microfilm and other reference material at the Mishawaka Penn Harris Library's Heritage Center, which is a great facility, and I got tremendous help there. We also visited key locations in Elkhart, South Bend, LaPorte, and Kingsbury related to the murder. But we were disappointed to learn, actually I was crushed to learn, that the county archives in South Bend had disposed of the trial transcript years before. 55 years, I was told, 55 years is when they dispose of felony trial transcripts. Perhaps the biggest break in my research came in January 2017 when Michael Vettman, archivist for the Indiana Archives and Records Administration, maybe some of you know Michael, have worked with him, he found a trial transcript for me in the Indiana Supreme Court files. I knew the case had been appealed to the Supreme Court, and during the process of buying mugshots of the killer and the killer's brother, he was just a burglar, but I wanted to buy those two mugshots from the Indiana Archives. I mentioned to Michael in an email, hey, if you're ever in the Supreme Court archives, I know the case was appealed to the Supreme Court. Let me know if you find a transcript. And 2 weeks later, he called me and said, Mr. Sosniecki, I've got it. And Zoom, Helen and I were on our way to Indianapolis to go through the transcript and other documentation Michael found. So that was 2 trips we made there. So that's when I realized for the first time I had enough material for a book. I finished my first draft of the book in February 2018. There you see my obligatory Facebook photo promoting it. Eventually, there were 12 drafts until recently, during a COVID-inspired cleanup of our office room. They were all stacked against a wall behind my desk. I began looking for a publisher in August of 2018. I knew that New York publishers, the big publishers in New York, wouldn't be interested in a first-time author without an agent. So I targeted smaller publishers that solicit manuscripts about true crime and or regional history. That was a bit of a learning experience. I had 8 rejections. One publisher was interested enough that I cut 25,000 words out of the manuscript at its request. The rejection came on the day I expected a contract. Very disappointing. But Kent State University Press was seriously interested from day one. I signed my contract in September 2019, completed the review of the page proofs last April. So it took almost a year to get the book published. And they did a terrific job designing the cover. I think it's just beautiful. So you guys all know about Indiana, geography of Indiana. This is something when I'm speaking in other states, I have to explain, talking a little about the murder here. The murder, the story takes place in 3 counties in Michiana, the 3 northernmost counties along the Michigan tier. Cecilia's family, the Hendersons, settled in Kingsbury, which is in LaPorte County. And Charlie Hornberg, her first husband, and he was my great-grandfather, also came from LaPorte County. Her second husband's family, the Ludwigs, settled in Elkhart County. The Hendersons came from Scotland, the Ludwigs from Germany. St. Joseph County in the middle is where the murder occurred and the trial occurred. Cecilia was 15 years old and 7 months pregnant with my grandfather when she married Charlie Hornberg in 1892. Let me repeat that, 15 years old and 7 months pregnant. So you think you have problems with your children or grandchildren, think of how the Hendersons felt, 15 years old, 7 months pregnant. A daughter, Lyle, was born in 1894. The marriage broke up 7 months after Lyle's birth when Cecilia moved out of the house. In the divorce decree issued in February 1896, Cecilia charged Charlie with cruel and inhumane treatment. Cecilia gained custody of the daughter. The son, my grandfather, lived with his father in Michigan. The oldest photo I have of my grandfather is on his own wedding day when he was 23. You can see that at the bottom right. The divorced Cecilia met her second husband, Alvin Ludwig, and that is Albin, B as in boy, not Alvin, and that became an issue during the legal proceedings. Alvin Ludwig in February 1901 met him in Elkhart, where she was working as a domestic. Alvin was the new owner of a saloon on Main Street in Elkhart, If you're familiar with Elkhart, it was where right downtown at the main crossroad, main intersection of Elkhart. It's where the Key Bank is right now. The Monument Saloon was named after a Civil War monument, and at that time it was a few blocks south of there. Now it is in a cemetery, but the monument still exists. Elvin and Cecilia were married on November 1st, 1901. They were a mismatched couple from the start. Alvin was 7 years older. Cecilia was at least 3 inches taller. Alvin would claim later that Cecilia did not have any money or many clothes at the time of their marriage. I did not care about it, he said. I married her only for love. The newlyweds tried living with Alvin's widowed mother in Elkhart, but after Cecilia was accused of striking Alvin's mother, and 10 days later, her sister-in-law, the couple was booted out of the house. They lived elsewhere in Elkhart until Alvin was able to sell the saloon. In 1903, they moved 11 miles west to Mishawaka for a fresh start. They bought a house in a new neighborhood at what then was the north edge of town. So you can see there were only 5 houses on the street, on their side of the street, at the time that they moved in there. They were very close to the train depot, which was convenient for Cecilia's mother to get on the train in Kingsbury to come and visit her. All of these businesses here were all part of the story. At the time, that was called Bridge Street. It is now known as North Main Street. Alvin found work as a shoemaker at the Mishawaka Woolen Manufacturing Company, a leading employer, often called the Rubber Works because it made rubber shoes. There was tension in the marriage. Alvin, who was said to have a ferocious temper, had caught Cecilia with other men, including twice in their own home, once hiding in a bedroom closet with a boarder. It was never quite revealed whether they were wearing any clothes when he caught them in the closet. The implication was they weren't. Besides being flirtatious, Cecilia had a foul mouth and a temper almost as bad as her husband's. Matters escalated the summer of 1906 when Cecilia's sister Jean, her own marriage falling apart, moved into the Ludwig home with her 2 young children. On the evening of Monday, September 24th, 1906, Alvin surreptitiously followed the 2 women to the 4 corners of downtown Mishawaka, and watching from the southeast corner, saw them talk to a man at the opposite corner. This is today, this would be South Main and Lincoln Way. At that point, it was Main Street and 2nd Street. So Alvin watched them talk to this man on this corner here, a man by the name of Ackerman. And then he watched them walk north to a boarding house where they met another man, Fred Young, who would go back to the house with them. Ackerman disappeared from them. That's the end of him in the story, other than Alvin's jealousy about Ackerman. But Fred Young would go back to the house, as he had many times over the past couple months. Alvin thought both men, Ackerman and Fred Young, were having affairs with Cecilia. He told a policeman by the name of James Anderson, who was standing at the corner, "I'm going to put a stop to that, and if anything happens, I want you to remember it." An evening of quarreling followed. Sometime between 1:30 and 2:30 the next afternoon, neighbors saw smoke coming out of the Ludwig house. Rescuers climbed through a window above the porch and discovered Alvin Ludwig, seemingly unconscious, on the floor of their upstairs bedroom. He was bleeding from razor wounds to his throat, arms, and legs. Mishawaka firefighters extinguished the fire, which originated in the bedroom closet. The closet door was closed, and a rocking chair had been placed in front of the door. Inside the closet, they discovered the nude, charred body of Cecilia Ludwig. The fire chief later said her flesh looked just about like a real hard-baked chicken. By the way, if I was in the right house, and I'm not 100% sure of that, I've been in that closet. The death certificate said Cecilia died from the shock of being burned. But how did that happen? We know that they argued beforehand and that a wooden potato masher was used as a weapon. but we don't know for sure who used it first, Albin or Cecilia. We know that either kerosene or gasoline was the accelerant that caused her body to burn so severely. How did that happen? And how did fresh blood end up elsewhere in the house? As newspapers covered the tragedy graphically, explicitly, and speculatively, Albin Ludwig slowly recovered from his knife wounds under guard at South Bend's Epworth Hospital. The dramatic trial began in South Bend with jury selection on Monday, April 22nd, 1907, putting the murder back on page one. The trial would last 5 days. Joseph Talbot, St. Joseph County's newly elected state's attorney, led the prosecution. Samuel Parker, a former state senator and one of the most respected lawyers in the region, led the defense team. Walter Funk, a lawyer in South Bend since 1896 and a circuit judge since 1900, presided over the trial. 29 witnesses testified for the state. That policeman, by the way, testified 4 times. He was called to the stand 4 times. 12 took the stand for the defense, including Albin Ludwig, who testified for hours. His testimony took up, I think, 84 pages, 86 pages in the trial transcript. He claimed he acted in self-defense. The jury heard that Albin and Cecilia quarreled again the morning of the murder, that their marriage was breaking up, and that they disagreed about the division of property, and that Cecilia was packing to leave. We know that they sat down for a noon meal of boiled meat and potatoes. There are 2 theories about what happened next. The prosecution theory, and I'm glad we have an attorney on the call, so that's great. Stephen, you might enjoy this. The prosecution theory was that Albin grabbed the potato masher, chased Cecilia up the stairs, knocked her unconscious with the potato masher, dragged her into the closet, poured gasoline or kerosene on her, then set her on fire. The prosecution believed that Albin closed the closet door, put a chair in front of it, then sliced himself up with a razor to make it look like self-defense. The defense theory was that Cecilia may have poisoned Albin's coffee at the noon meal and that he went upstairs feeling ill. Albin then remembered while he was laying on the bed, feeling sorry for himself, he remembered that he had a life insurance policy that benefited Cecilia. He was looking for the policy in Cecilia's trunk in the closet when Cecilia came upstairs and she was wielding the potato masher. This is the defense theory. They argued vehemently about the division of the property, and Cecilia swung the potato masher at her husband. Albin claimed he warded off the blow, grabbed Cecilia by the neck, pushed her against the closet wall where her head hit a wire hook. She fell to the floor unconscious, and the kerosene lantern, which also had fallen, set her on fire. At the trial, Albin admitted to choking his wife in the closet, but conveniently, he couldn't remember anything that happened afterward. The trial testimony was riveting. The newspaper coverage was explicit, but with no witnesses to the crime other than the defendant, all the evidence was circumstantial. A partially burned potato masher found in the closet was introduced as Exhibit A. No, I get asked, was it this one? No, I bought this at an antique store in Rolla, Missouri. It's a great prop though, and it works as a great pointer if I'm doing a presentation in person. Albin and his attorneys had hoped for a verdict of manslaughter, which carried a sentence of 2 to 14 years. But late on the evening of the trial's 5th day, the jury returned a verdict of 2nd-degree murder, murder with malice, but not premeditation. There's no question in my mind that Albin Ludwig killed my great-grandmother and that a potato masher was used as a weapon. But who swung it first, Albin or Cecilia? That's one of the unsolved mysteries. I wonder if the verdict might have been 1st-degree murder or just manslaughter, which is what the defense had hoped for, manslaughter. If there had been fingerprint technology, if there had been blood typing, if there had been DNA testing available to determine if the bloody fingerprints around the house had belonged to Albin or to those who rescued him. I wonder whose fingerprints were on the bloody straight razor that caused Albin's wounds, Albin's or Cecilia's. I wonder if a tin can found in the closet had contained gasoline or kerosene, or if it simply smelled like smoke. I wonder what the impact was of the crime scene having been accessed by neighbors and even reporters before the investigation was completed. I wonder why Albin's brother now, was allowed to sweep up debris in the closet, then testify about evidence he supposedly found there. Or did he plant it there? I wonder if today's technology would show that Albin's coffee cup contained traces of poison. He thought the coffee Cecilia served him at the noon meal tasted peculiar that day. I wonder if traces of blood were on the potato masher found in the closet. And I wonder if Albin's sentence would have been harsher if Cecilia's sister Jean, who witnessed the quarrels leading up to the murder, especially the night before and the morning of the murder, I wonder if Jean, what would have happened if Jean could have been found to testify. Albin Ludwig was sentenced to life in the Indiana State Prison North in Michigan City. He served only about 16 years, a term surprisingly not uncommon for Indiana life sentences of that era. He returned to Elkhart. He followed his parole instructions and for many years worked in the restaurant business, including in this building on South Main Street. He died in 1954 at age 85 and is buried in an unmarked grave in Elkhart's Rice Cemetery. The rest of the Ludwig family is buried in another cemetery. Albin is in Rice Cemetery. No obit appeared in the Elkhart Truth newspaper, and we looked everywhere for an obit. We never found one. Fortunately, one of Albin's uncle's descendants found it in found a death date in a book that was published by a funeral home of services it handled in certain years. One of the joys of my research was discovering distant family members like Chuck Ellsworth, son of the 6-year-old boy whom newspapers speculated may have witnessed the murder. Ironically, Chuck has close friends in Seymour, Missouri, where Helen and I owned a newspaper in the 1990s. So Chuck and I have become friends as well as cousins, and we've met 3 times now. Now, I'm going to talk, since this is an authors group, I've got some extra slides here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about promoting the book. And as anyone else who had a book published in 2020, and including Janice, as you know, the pandemic made it a challenging year to promote a book, especially for a first-time author. So at first, I didn't know how much promotion the publisher would do and how much I would have to do. And I learned quickly that I would be doing most of it. So, which other authors tell me that's not a surprise. So promoting the Potato Masher murder became almost a full-time job. I created author pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Goodreads, and Amazon. In fact, I have 3 Facebook pages. One of them is the author page. I posted regularly to all of them, plus LinkedIn and Reddit. I used an inexpensive software called snappa.com, snappa.com, to create social media graphics. It is free software if you're doing 3 a month. I think it's $150 a year for unlimited use of it. And it's fairly easy to use. It has templates for all social media. So I've used it pretty frequently. And I learned how to target Facebook ads. And so for $10 a piece, they seem to be working when I target them to certain areas where I might be doing a book signing, or if I target them to Mishawaka. And of course, I solicited interviews wherever I could get them, and print and broadcast. I just did a interview with the host of a radio show called the Mystery Hour radio show, and he lives in Canada, but the show is syndicated to radio stations in Los Angeles and Palm Springs and Riverside, California, and also Salt Lake City. So that interview will be released on Thursday night. I think the podcast will be up on Friday. And I've had good success getting into print. And of course, when you've owned a few newspapers, you've got a lot of friends. So the newspapers I formerly owned have been very generous with their publicity. I did do book signings. They were a rarity, but I did a few here in Missouri. The book signings I already had scheduled in Indiana were out of the question, at least for last year. You might note my potato masher face mask, which I created on Zazzle.com. Helen just ordered a new one for me yesterday on Shutterfly using some different artwork. And the potato masher sweatshirt, which I wear to some events, also was done on Zazzle.com, Zazzle.com. I had scheduled 4 in-person book programs for July at libraries in Indiana and a Rotary Club in Indiana. And before the pandemic hit, all became virtual presentations. But despite the risk, and at my age, yeah, it was a risk, I still did several in-person prep programs in Missouri. My favorite here at the left was on the stage of a restored movie theater in Seymour, Missouri, where, as I mentioned before, Helen and I owned a newspaper in the 1990s. The photo at the upper left shows the newspaper's current owner, who we hired in 1996, and he's introducing me. Unfortunately, Dan didn't put his coffee cup down when he introduced me, but that's all right. That was cool. Zoom became a lifesaver, as you guys know from your meetings. Of the 19 book programs I did last year, most were virtual. You are my 20th program, the first of this year. Zoom enabled me to speak virtually to libraries, service clubs, and other organizations in 5 states, and that wouldn't have been financially feasible in person. I'm a Rotarian, and the words is spreading about me being a speaker. You know, Rotary clubs are looking for speakers every week. Kiwanis clubs, Optimist clubs, the same thing with them. But as the word spreads on Rotary, I think I've been in Virginia speaking to a Rotary club. I'm doing one in Ohio in April, I think. So that's been cool. And this will look familiar to those of you who are authors. Every morning I check my Amazon rankings and try to figure out what the heck they mean, because I still haven't figured that out. So I thank you in advance for reading The Potato Masher Murder. I hope you do, and listening to my story of how it came about. You can order copies from any bookseller online, Kent State or Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Amazon, just about anywhere. And I'm going to end the slide share here, the screen share, and you can see me again. And Janet or Janice, I'm open to questions for as long as you guys want to ask.
I think you got the wrong guy for the murder.
I have had readers tell me that. I have. I've had readers, a couple of readers, a couple of friends here in Lebanon, Missouri, tell me they think that it was one of the boyfriends who did the murder.
Well, I think I have conclusive proof.
You do. So do I have a sequel?
Yeah. So anyway, at least some people get it.
Yeah.
You had a weird sense of humor, Steve.
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
All right. I was wondering, what was your reaction when you first learned that your great grandmother had been murdered so brutally by her husband?
You know, my brother and I have talked about this. We heard it mentioned at family gatherings, but not a lot. You know, Christmas and Thanksgiving and birthdays and so forth. And it was kind of cryptically, and the little kids didn't hear too much about it. And there was kind of sarcasm toward my great grandmother, toward Cecilia, and as if she was being blamed for it. And Cecilia, of course, there are no heroes in this book. They were both not the best of people. But so I knew there'd been a murder, and I think my reaction, you know, I'm a reporter. I think I'm pretty far removed now generationally from being emotionally involved in feeling a certain way. You know, it wasn't really a shock. I'd heard enough to know about it. I think her behavior was a shock. I think Albin's behavior was a shock as I learned that. But the fact that she was murdered and brutally murdered, that didn't surprise me so much after the years of wondering about it, and of course covering murders myself.
Mhm. Well, I'm curious, who do you think, which theory do you believe is the correct one? Or if either one is, you know, on what happened that day?
I think the prosecution theory is probably the correct one, because if you go by Albin's theory, which does make sense up to a certain point, you can go by the defense theory up to a certain point. But how did that fire? This closet is like a 6x8 walk-in closet, and if I haven't been in that closet, I've been in the closet of the house next door, which is similar design. Unfortunately, they changed the house numbers at some point, and that's why I'm confused about whether I was in the right house. But how are you going to have a fire that burns that hot without there being an accelerant poured on the body, especially when you've closed the closet door and there's no windows in there? There had to be an accelerant. It had to be one heck of a fire. The fire was already generating smoke out the west window, which means it was going through the bedroom. So Albin's theory, which was basically, you see, I got props for everything, that Albin's theory that the kerosene lantern fell and that's what ignited the fire. You know, there's not enough kerosene in a lantern to have caused a fire that really charred the body. So I think the prosecution theory is probably the right theory, or maybe it's a combination of theories. But he had to have poured something on top of the body in order for it to burn like that.
Mhm.
I got a question. Can I ask?
Yeah.
Did you say she was naked in the closet?
You know, well, in the closet with the border.
No, in the closet with the fire.
Well, all her clothes were burned off. The only thing that they found were iron corset stays.
Oh,
And-
okay. So she had been dressed at the time she was ignited.
She had been. No, where I questioned whether she was dressed was when this boarder by the name of Smoke Minen, when Albin came home from work, he went to work really early, and I'm assuming that that's because without air conditioning in factories in those days, if it was the summertime, they would start very early in the morning and quit for the day at noon or early afternoon. But Albin had gone to work and he didn't have his pocket watch, so he came back home about 7:30 in the morning, and he remembers the exact day. It was like September 3rd, 1903 something. So he remembers that. And he came home and got his watch, and he was looking for Cecilia. And her clothes were on the bed in the bedroom, but Cecilia wasn't there. So he started walking around the house calling for Cecilia. And he walked to a bedroom on the opposite side of the second floor where they had a boarder by the name of Smoke Minen. And he found her in the closet. He found her and Smoke in the closet hiding. And the implication is that she was not wearing clothes. Now, he repeated this story many times, but, and he never said that. He may have been too polite to say it, but there was just this implication. I thought, if they're hiding in there, why would they be hiding in there? If she was fully dressed and everything, they would just be in the bedroom talking or something. So that there's this implication that she was at least partially undressed.
And one other follow-up question. Did you ever track down her sister's descendants
Yes.
to see if they
And
knew anything?
her sister's descent, and this is so cool. That's the Jean Ellsworth. That's her little boy was Charles Ellsworth. And there is some evidence that he may have witnessed the murder or part of the murder. Okay, so it's Charles's son, Chuck, who I tracked down, and we can credit Helen for that, because Helen, who's sitting here across from me, Helen read every draft, and at one point, one of the drafts, she said, "You know, you need a little bit more color." And I thought, and I thought, okay, so I know what happened to of course, my grandpa. I know what happened to his sister. I know what happened to the one of Jean Ellsworth's children, to the daughter. I don't know what happened to the little boy who may have witnessed it. And thank God for these websites on the internet. Within 24 hours, I had tracked down Chuck Ellsworth, and within 8 hours, I had interviewed him. Now, Chuck knew nothing about this. The little boy grew up, which would be his, the little boy would be his father, actually adoptive father, and never mentioned. And his grandfather, who would have been Jean's first husband, all he would talk about Jean being a runaround and getting in and out. And Jean and Cecilia both had the same personality. Cecilia was 4 years older than Jean, but they were both runs around. And I think that Jean probably, her showing up and moving in gave Cecilia a companion to get about around town. I mean, they had been gone on this day before the murder, on the September 24th, 1906, the day before. They'd been gone all day shopping. They said they were going to buy shoes. They'd been gone all day, and they were home for an hour for the evening meal, and then they took off again. And this whole story was of the descendants I checked down, my new cousins, who I didn't know existed. Very few of them knew very much about this. They would just hear bits and pieces like I did. So they were interested in finding out more too.
I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
I'll sort of ball them into one here. But obviously, we don't have a copy of the book to look at here. So I don't know
I
how
hope
you
I hope you
this.
have one. I hope you have one very shortly.
Janice got it.
Thank you, Janice.
Here's the question, and Janice knows a little bit about this, and I've been thinking about what to do with the story from my family research that I stumbled on. But how is the book written, and did you consider other ways to write it? That being, you could write the story just as your story. You start with your grandmother and you start laying the groundworks and the foundation for the murder, and then you go through the murder and you go through the trial and the sentence and whatever. And that's your story. But also, and the book that comes to mind is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. I don't know if you've read that or not. Highly recommend it. But she wrote the book really in two ways. One was the story of Henrietta Lacks, who is this woman whose DNA or cells ended up being used without her consent in hundreds of thousands of research projects. But she told that story, but she also told the story of her following the research and following the path of learning the story of Henrietta Lacks and how she had to deal with relatives and all of that. And then a third way of writing it, it seems to me, would be you take what you uncover and then you write as a fictional account, or as Capote did, a nonfiction novel, where you insert expected conversations that may or may not have happened, but which would tell the story that way. I mean, those are three ways of writing this story that strike me, and I don't know which one you chose, and also if you chose or considered writing it any of the other ones.
Okay, Stephen, thanks. Good questions. First of all, I can't do fiction, and I'm those of you who can do fiction, I'm envious of you. I spent 43 years in the newspaper business. I'm still involved in the newspaper business in many ways. So I can't do fiction. So I had to write it straight. The manuscript initially, my idea was to start with what happened the night before. that it was very dramatic, and I reconstructed the night before using the trial testimony of Albin, of the neighbors who testified at the trial because they were involved in some of the stuff that happened the night before. Fred Young testified at the trial. So I used all of that testimony. Plus, when Albin went to prison, he I guess on the first couple of days he was in prison, he had to write a statement of the crime. So I have a copy of a 6.5-page statement, handwritten statement that Albin wrote in 1907 describing the crime. So I was able to reconstruct the night before. So I wanted to do that and how it was leading to something terrible happening. So that was the first chapter. Then I went back. Then the next chapter, I talked about the families, how they came to America, why they came to America. And initially that was 3 chapters. I did each family. I did the Henderson family, I did the Hornberg family, the first husband's family, and I did the Ludwig family. And I had, and then I went into to the murder and chronologically the events of the case. Well, I had 4 beta readers of the first draft. And I say the first draft, technically it was the second draft. The first draft is where I took all of my notes, everything I had, newspaper clippings, everything, and retyped them into chronologically so I could follow things. But the real first draft, where I actually did writing, I had 4 beta readers. 3 of them were all friends of mine. 3 of them were had written books. 3 of them were journalists. One of them was our local library director, who I've known for when my wife and I published the daily newspaper here 20 years ago. I've known her for that long. So I had them. And one of them said, hey, you're not writing a family history. The family part of it needs to be condensed into a single chapter. So I did that. And then Kent State, one of the things that one of the external reviewers who they had read the book suggested that I do a preface that told my story of writing the book. So like the first part of my presentation to you, when I talk about my journey to writing a book, that is a preface, and it includes comments from some of the other relatives who I discovered. So I cover that, and that's how I got what we wound up with.
Gary, I have 2 things.
Sure.
One, when you get a second, can you switch me back to being the host? And all you have to do is click on my name and scroll down and make me the host. But the question I had is, one of the challenges of writing about such a different time and era is really capture a feel for what life was like then. So can you talk a little bit about how you came to understand like the environment that your great grandmother was living in?
As I did the research, I would do research into the communities, and I had multiple communities to research, Mishawaka and South Bend and Elkhart and LaPorte and Kingsbury. So I got a feel for what life was like then by through the history books of those communities, and also through the newspapers. I told, and Janice, if Janice has read the book, she sees in some areas I move away from the main story a little bit and tell like what a sale was, that what kind of clothing was being sold, groceries were being sold, things that are happening in the community, efforts to get new industry, efforts to sell housing lots. So I talk about some of that. I found it interesting that the Ludwigs used a gasoline cook stove. Now, can you imagine that? I realize it was a different blend of gasoline from what we put in our vehicles today. But a gasoline cook stove, because part of the story was that Cecilia sent Albin out on that Tuesday morning to buy gasoline for the cook stove so she could cook the meal, which was going to be their final meal together. So he went to the grocery store and bought 2 gallons of gasoline. So as I discovered things just by doing my regular research.
That sounds pretty interesting. Was there anything that really surprised you for good or ill about your great-grandmother?
Well, I was surprised that she was promiscuous, and I say flirtatious, perhaps promiscuous, but I think that if you read the book, you see the examples that Albin cited, and there's no reason to doubt him. So I was surprised by that. I was surprised by the language, her language. There's no reason to doubt that her language was as coarse as it was, and so I found that really interesting, and that was surprising. And of course, it's a surprise that nobody talked about this. And the new cousins I discovered, and also on the Ludwig side, very few knew about this or knew very little about it. And somebody on the Ludwig side was doing their own research, and she helped me quite a bit. And I think this was just a dark family secret. I think the families were ashamed of it, embarrassed by it. I think, and I think Helen has mentioned this, that my mother, who would have been Cecilia's granddaughter, although Cecilia was dead by the time my mother was born, I think my mother, she would be proud that I've written a book, had a book published, but she would be terribly embarrassed about that her neighbors now would know about this dark secret. And my response is, yeah, but every one of her neighbor's children has bought a copy of the book. So
So how old was your great grandmother when she died?
30. She was just 30, and she'd had a
Oh,
tough life in those 30 years.
yeah, well, to start out and have a child at
Yeah.
15, I mean, she
Yeah.
was a child herself.
Yeah,
Oh, there's a lot in the background there
yeah, there is.
that can explain a lot of her actions, perhaps.
Yeah, she was young.
Yeah, he was 7 years older, but she was bigger than him.
Hmm.